Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know what you had for lunch, but I wish I'd had some of it. I do want to say I'm delighted to be back in Cleveland and glad to be back at the City Club. And I hold here in my hand a membership to the City Club given to me by Senator Metzenbaum. Now, I'd rather have his vote on all the issues, but I take this. Actually, I want to thank Howard Metzenbaum and Lou Stokes and Eric Fingerhut and Congressman Hoke and all the others who are here, your mayor, your state treasurer, your state attorney general. I'm delighted to be here with all of you, and I saw in the introduction that you mentioned something I was going to say in my own remarks. I very much enjoyed being here last year and having the opportunity to talk in Cleveland about family values. 2 years ago, I came here, the mayor hosted the Democratic Leadership Council's national convention, and I said at that time that I thought the time had come for us to move beyond the political debate in Washington between one party which seemed to have advocated the politics of abandonment and another which seemed to advocate a politics of entitlement. It seemed to me the time had come for us to face our problems squarely as a country and to try to do something about them, but not to pretend that the government could give a solution to the American people, solutions to problems that require all of us to give something ourselves and to do more. I feel that even more strongly today. For 110 days, I have lived and worked in Washington, D.C. I think that all of us would agree that for too long, our great nation's capital, which is filled with monuments to men and women who have done so much to bring us to this point in history, has practiced more politics than progress. I'm glad to be back here in a place like Cleveland where it's not possible to produce more politics than progress. Here you have to produce steel or automobiles or biomedical technology, real things with real value. This debate in which we are all engaged about America's future should properly take place here, in the industrial belt, and in the grain belt, and in the sun belt, and in the Bible belt, all across America, where people live in a world that is determined by consequences and not by talk. If you're a mayor in a city like Cleveland, you either provided more houses and people moved into them, or it didn't happen. There either are more economic opportunities or there aren't. You can measure that. In Washington, we're told that the most important thing to do is not more than one thing at a time. And some want you to do one thing at a time because it's easier to stop one thing at a time than it is a whole range of things. But I would argue to you, my fellow Americans, that the challenges of the moment require both a focus and a discipline on the big problems of our nation and a determination to face them in a comprehensive way. The challenge of international competition, new technologies, soaring healthcare costs, defense cuts without an offsetting strategy to invest in America, a global recession, a global inability of wealthy countries to create new jobs in an open and competitive environment. All these things create great new challenges for our country. Here in the heartland, I've seen you stepping up to the challenges. When the mayor and I rode in from the airport today, he talked to me about how people were moving from the suburbs back into the cities, how more houses were being built. I looked at some of your economic development projects. I see a partnership between the public and private sector here that does not require someone to check his political label in when you roll up your sleeves and go to work. That is the sort of thing we need to do in Washington, and the kind of spirit I hope to be able to bring to our nation's capital. I think that I believe very strongly that in the last 12 years, our nation's government has collectively produced two immense problems. Problem number one, obviously, is the enormous explosion of the national debt and the continuing growth of the annual federal deficit. In 1980, our debt was $1 trillion. Today, it's $4 trillion and rising. It's about 2/3 of our annual national product. Much bigger percentage of our annual deficit than, for example, the debt in Japan is. Now, how did it happen? It happened partly because we liked it when politicians told us what we wanted to hear. It happened because we had big tax cuts and big spending increases at the same time. First, the spending increases were in defense, and then when defense began to be cut, they were totally offset, those cuts, by even bigger increases in health care spending through Medicare and Medicaid, the fact that 1/10 of America is now on food stamps, and by huge increases in interest payments on the national debt. The deficit is also aggravated by the fact that we index both payments to people and income taxes. Now, it's fair to index income taxes. If you get pushed by inflation into a higher bracket, we adjust the brackets upward. For the first time, that's happened in the last few years. No one can doubt that is fair, but consider the impact on that. If you offset on the one, hello, Congressman Brown, I didn't see you out there. You offset on the one hand your income, and at the same time, you promise to pay more out. So everybody that gets a salary or a retirement check, their payments go up with inflation, even as your intake comes down with inflation. So these are the two things that have created the kind of problem we have in the budget deficit. The second thing that happened, interestingly enough, is that that portion of our government budget, which is in partnership with the private sector, making investments in our future and promoting economic growth, actually shrank as a percentage of the whole, and often in absolute terms. So that at a time when we are more dependent than ever before on how skilled our workforce is, the federal commitment to education and training of the workforce went down as other nations were exploding their commitment. At a time when we were cutting high technology in the defense sector, the peace dividend was not automatically reinvested in new technologies in the commercial sector and new partnerships. Why? Because, as any member of Congress here will tell you, the easiest place to cut spending is in that broad category known as discretionary, non-defense spending. That doesn't mean anything. That's a lot of gobbledygook. But when you strip it away, a lot of it is our investment in our future. So we wind up with this unusual difficulty, a huge debt, an increasing deficit, and a diminished commitment to invest in our future. The results have been clear. A limited ability to create new jobs, even when productivity is growing. We're allegedly in an economic recovery of some 17 months in duration, and yet the unemployment rate is higher this month than it was at the depths of the recession. We had a huge increase in productivity in the last 3 months of last year, and in the first 3 months of this year, another big increase in output per person in the manufacturing sector, but that money now is being plowed back into new technologies, are kept for profits, not to increase new jobs. As any small business person here knows, it is difficult to increase employment in a small business because of the extra added cost. By the time you pay the Social Security and the workers' comp and all the other costs, you've got more and more small businesses using overtime workers or part-time workers, and fewer new jobs being created there. So here we are. What are we to do? I have asked the United States Congress to adopt a plan that I believe over the next 5 years will do something to make real, measurable change in both those areas. It will substantially reduce the federal deficit in the most disciplined deficit reduction plan ever presented to Congress, and it will permit some very disciplined, targeted increases in those investments which are critical to our future. We do it by a combination of things: cutting spending, raising taxes, and targeting investment. Because this involves a whole lot of change, as you might imagine, it challenges a lot of established interests in Washington, who would prefer that things go on as they are. Because while as a whole our country is disadvantaged, I would argue, by what we're doing, certain specific groups benefit from everything that is done. Now the lobbyists are lining the corridors of Washington as never before. There are about 80,000 of them there. And unless all the American people speak out loud and clear, it's going to be hard for us to hold this program together. There are those fighting for the national interest and those who are properly there to be heard about more narrow interests. There are those who believe we can make things better and those who believe that any change will make things worse for them. There are those who believe that we can spend money more productively and less wastefully, and others who believe that we ought to just keep on spending it the way we are now. This is the oldest conflict in our history and the eternal battle of any great democracy. The impetus for inertia is always strong, and very often a country does not have the courage to change until it is almost too late. But I believe with all my heart that the voters said last November, not just those who voted for me either, but all the voters said, we know this country has got to take a different course. We know we can't keep drifting. We know we can't wander. We have to have a plan. We have to follow it. We have to try to make some things happen that will lift this country's spirits again, lift this country's prospects again, and yes, that will insist that all of us have the discipline and will and vision to change. Now, I think that there are a lot of I would call them preachers of pessimism in our nation's capital who underestimate the capacity of the American people to know the cost of what is happening to us right now. I readily admit that none of these changes can occur unless a vast majority of us understand the costs of what is happening to us right now. The cost of maintaining this deficit at its present level, the cost of maintaining the present health care system, the cost of maintaining a system which is underinvesting in our future compared to all of our major competitors in a high-wage, high-growth economy, the cost of maintaining the credit crunch on small business, the cost of having no technology policy, the cost of having no plan to convert from a defense to a domestic economy. I would argue that those costs are very high. The cost of having no strategy to put young people to work in our cities and instead spending money to pay for the cleanup and the consequences of drug problems, gang problems, gun problems. The cost of the status quo are very, very high, even when you don't see it directly attributed on the government's ledger books. I believe we don't see that enough. So I think we can do more than one thing at once. I think we can reduce the deficit and provide the opportunity for all of our young people to go to college. I think we can reduce the deficit and provide decent job training and education for our working people when the average worker will change jobs 8 times in a lifetime. I believe we can reduce the deficit and put more police on our streets to protect our communities better. I believe we can reduce the deficit and offer more targeted incentives for real investment to American businesses and to their workers. I believe we can reduce the deficit and change the welfare system so that we move people from welfare to work after a certain amount of time. I believe we can do these things. I believe we're strong enough to provide for a budget that reduces the deficit and invests in the future in a prudent way. And I can't help noting that some of those who say that we can't do that are the very ones that brought the debt from $1 trillion to $4 trillion over the last 12 years. You know, our greatest Republican president, perhaps our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, used to tell a story about when he was practicing law in Illinois. It kind of reminds me about some of these folks today talking about the deficit in Washington. He said it reminded him of a man who killed his parents and then threw himself on the mercy of the court because he was an orphan. I think we've all got to understand that we didn't get where we are overnight. We have to accept where we are. I don't care about who should bear the blame, but I don't think we should have people pointing fingers who helped to create the current course of events. We should pull together. My whole approach has been to try to say to the American people, we are all in this together. If we ask what's in this program for me instead of what's in it for us, we'll all find something we don't like, including me. If the issue is going to be now what's in it for me instead of what's in it for us, we are defeated before we began. But the what's in it for me decade didn't work out very well for us over the long run, and I think we can do better. Now, shortly after I took office, I submitted to Congress a blueprint of a budget that makes now over 200 specific budget cuts, reduces the deficit by over $500 billion over 5 years, and refocuses the priorities of our government from consumption to investment in our future. Both houses of the Congress passed that blueprint in record time. First time in 17 years, the budget resolution had passed within the calendar required. Our commitment to cut the deficit clearly boosted confidence on Wall Street, and it's beginning to be felt on Main Street. It is beginning to change lives for the better already. Starting after the November election, when we announced a clear determination to bring the deficit down, interest rates have been going down. The trend line is steady with only minor interruptions whenever there's some sense that maybe we won't really reduce this deficit after all. The plan that I announced and the outline the Congress adopted clearly played a major role in bringing interest rates down to historic lows, mortgage rates to 20-year lows. There's been a huge wave of refinancing. I'll bet you anything there are lots of people in this room that since November have refinanced their home mortgages. I know that there are people in every city in America who have gotten business loans, whose consumer loans have gone down, whose cost of car financing have gone down. It is estimated that in the aggregate, if we can keep these rates down just a few more months, this will lead to enough refinancing of debt that it will release another $100 billion to be reinvested into this economy. That's 1 2/3% of our total gross domestic product in a given year. That is a huge impetus to stay on the track we're on to bring this deficit down. According to a bipartisan survey, a poll recently conducted, in these conditions, 74% of all Americans now believe that home ownership is within reach for most young people. You know what it was a year ago? The reverse, 47%. The reason for the change is obvious: lower interest rates. Businesses are paying less to borrow. That means new investments and new jobs. The taxpayers, by the way, are saving billions of dollars in financing the government debt. We've already brought the deficit down this year because of those interest rates. Along with that, we have launched a real effort to attack the credit crunch in partnership with community banks all across America, and that should mean that farmers, small business people, and homeowners will be able to do even more in the weeks and months ahead. These are things that happen when a people take some responsibility for their financial future. And if we can keep going, now having passed the budgetary blueprint, The Congress is now about to move into the specifics in what is called the budget reconciliation process. That means they've got to take the targets that were adopted in the budget resolution and specify how we're going to meet those targets. What kind of taxes are going to be raised? What kind of spending is going to be cut? What kinds of investments are going to be made? That is the process now beginning. And that is the kind of thing that will require us all to make tough choices to make good on the results that are being achieved. I've asked Congress to join me in making real spending cuts, and that process is now unfolding. Our budget contains, as I said, over 200 specific cuts. I thought I should start as president by setting an example. In the new fiscal year, we'll be operating the White House with a staff that is 25% smaller than my predecessors. I must say, I made that commitment, and we're going to do all that work. I have to say, in parentheses, I didn't know that I'd receive more letters in the first 100 days than came into the White House in all of 1992. So if you haven't gotten your letter answered, hold on, I'm coming. But we're trying to do it. We are going to reduce, just in our office alone, $10 million in payroll and perks and cost of government. In the executive branch, I have ordered over the next 4 years a 14% cumulative reduction in the administrative costs of the federal government, a 100,000 person reduction in the federal payroll by attrition. That will save well over $9 billion. I have asked the federal employees to have a pay freeze in this coming year and reduced raises in all the rest of this first term. I just left the Galleria, and right across the street there's a big federal office building, and a lot of those federal employees said they weren't looking forward particularly to doing without a raise next year. We have put the clamps on federal spending, and we have asked federal employees to make a sacrifice. I didn't see how I could ask people to raise their taxes unless the people who are getting the tax money also made a sacrifice. I come from a rural state where the Rural Electrification Agency, the REA, has been very important to my family and our people. They have brought light and hope to millions of Americans. But now our country is about 100% electrified. And I have recommended that we reduce the interest subsidies to the REA, something that is tough to do for members of Congress from rural areas and for this president who came from that place. I may get shocked instead of light when I go home on that. I've asked the Congress to join me in repealing the special interest exemption for lobbying that's only been in the tax code since 1962. Before that, it didn't exist. You had to pay if you wanted to go lobby. Now the taxpayers actually at large bear the burden of people's lobbying costs. Now, again, I'm all for people lobbying. I think, and frankly, it's a good thing if it's in balance. But I don't see why the taxpayers should subsidize someone's costs when they go and try to influence the outcome of legislation in Washington. I've asked to cut urban programs that don't work. While I plead guilty to trying to get more community block grant funds for Mayor White so he could build more houses in Cleveland, I also called for the abolition of a designated project program at the Housing and Urban Development Department because it had no real accountability to the taxpayers. It cost over $100 million a year. I also believe that after all these cuts are in place, if you really expect this deficit to be brought down, we have got to raise some more tax money. And I believe that we ought to do it in a progressive way. I can tell you this, just to start out, I have proposed more budget cuts and more taxes than I thought I would when I was running, and the reason is simple. After the election, the government said the deficit was going to be $50 billion a year bigger in 3 of the next 4 years than we thought, and $15 billion in the 4th year. The deficit was announced after the election in each year to be much, much bigger than had previously been forecast. So we asked for about 73% of the money to be paid for by people with incomes above $100,000. The rest to be paid for, 27%, by the 93% or so of us that are under $100,000. And then there is an exemption in effect for the energy tax burden for lower middle income working people, and middle income working people with children up to the levels of about $29,000 by the increase in the earned income tax credit, which will offset the impact of the energy tax. I think it is a very fair program, and I hope it will be adopted. We take on the entitlements in this plan. People say, why don't you take on the entitlements? I'll tell you why, because people get mad at you when you do that. We ask Social Security recipients who are in the top 20% of income to pay taxes on more of their income than they do today coming from Social Security. We have done our best to restrain the exploding cost of Medicare. We have taken on these tough issues to cut spending and to raise some money. But I would also argue to you that we must have some disciplined increases in investment. And I'll tell you where my recommendations are. I recommend, first of all, that we focus on rewarding work, strengthening families, and creating more jobs, especially for the middle class. These ideas include the following. This is where we spend money. First of all, in tax cuts to encourage investment for new jobs. Private enterprise is, after all, the engine of this economy, not the government, and we need to get it running as close as we can to full throttle. So there are substantial new incentives in this program for both large business and small business to lower their taxes through direct investments. Investments mean lower taxes and more jobs, and therefore more revenue to the government by putting people to work if you target it to investment. I think it's very important. Secondly, we focus especially on the depressed areas of the country, both rural and urban, with establishing a new network of community development banks to make loans to people who want to go into business in these areas, with special incentives to get others to do the same thing, with special kinds of enterprise zones, especially in the urban and rural areas, which are particularly depressed, that will at least give us a chance to see if free enterprise alone can revive these areas if the government gives them enough incentives. These are things, I believe, that will make the private sector work for all Americans. The plan also strengthens our schools by providing access to Head Start to all children who need it, by setting higher standards throughout the country and enshrining in the law the national education goals and the standards that they will produce. The plan encourages experimentation with things like public school choice and charter schools and public schools. It contains a bold national apprenticeship program where the federal government is a partner with the private sector and state and local government in helping to retrain the workforce for a lifetime. We are the only advanced country, the only one that doesn't worry about having a systematic way of training high school graduates who don't go on to college. And yet we now have clear evidence in the 1990 census that anybody who graduates from high school but gets no further training, or who drops out of high school, who goes into the workforce, is likely to have declining earnings. This is good money, and it will be really shaped by private sector people and public trainers at the local grassroots level, not a national program, but a national partnership. And it will really, really increase the productivity of the American workforce. This plan also will open the doors of college education to all Americans by changing the nature of the student loan program, and I want to explain this. Today, the way the student loan program works, you can go down to your bank, you borrow the money, you pay it back based on how much you borrow. If you don't pay it back, the government gives the bank 90% of the loan. That's the way it works. The college dropout rate is more than twice the high school dropout rate, in part because of the cost of a college education. The student loan program is very profitable for many banks and for the national mortgage organization that's behind it. They have made a killing out of it. It's terrible for the taxpayers. Why? Because if somebody defaults on the loan, there's no incentive to go get it, because there's a 90% government guarantee, and no offense to all of us lawyers in the crowd, but it's going to cost you more than 10% of the loan to pay a lawyer to go get it. Not only that, the repayment terms are often too burdensome. Here's what we want to do. Set up a system to make the loans directly. Let people pay back the loans only when they go to work, and then as a percentage of their income. So no one will ever not be able to repay. And no one will be discouraged from taking a lower paying but perhaps more rewarding job as a teacher or a police officer or whatever. But collect the money at tax time so you cannot beat the bill. Don't let people welch on their student loan anymore. And we estimate this system can save you $4.3 billion in the next 5 years. That's a lot of money. Let me tell you what we'd like to do with that money, or some of it anyway. We'd like to give tens of thousands of our young people the opportunity to earn credit against college or pay off their college loan by doing community service before, during, or after they go to college. Working with housing projects, working with environmental projects, working to help keep streets safer, working after they graduate as teachers or police officers in underserved areas. We can have a program of national service that is community-based that will help us solve so many of our problems. I got a letter from a friend of mine with whom I was in grade school the other day, reminiscing about all kinds of things. And she had a very wise thing in this letter. She said, you know, somebody came up to me the other day and said, how are we going to save all these kids that are in trouble? How are we going to get them back? And she said, without even thinking, I said, we're going to get them back just the way we lost them, one at a time. Now you think about that. That's what this national service proposal could do. It could give all kinds of young people a chance to do something meaningful to help earn credit to go to college and to help solve the problems of Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus and Dayton and every other community in this country. That's the kind of thing that I think is money well spent, and we can pay for it if we just have the discipline to make the student loan program make sense again. I think we have to do it. Let me say there are many other issues I could talk about, but I want to mention one other. I have spent a lot of the last 6 years working on the issue of welfare. I have probably spent more time than any elected politician talking to people who live on welfare checks. And I can tell you that nobody likes the system, least of all most people who live on it. You got one in... But if you want to move people from welfare to work, you have to realize 3 or 4 basic things. First of all, you got to make work pay. Welfare can never be a better deal. Secondly, you got to realize that it's not the welfare check that keeps people on welfare as much as it is the child care and the medical coverage for the children. Most people on welfare have kids. So, third thing you got to realize is that most people, not all, but most people on welfare are woefully undereducated and can't claim a very good paycheck in the market that we're in. Not all, but a lot. So what is the answer? The answer is a comprehensive plan that will empower people to go to work, require them to take jobs when they can, and set a date certain beyond which no check comes without an effort being made either in a public or a private job. That's what I think should be done. We should do away with the system as we know it forever. It is a shackle on the spirit of millions of Americans, and we can change it. Now, here's what we're going to propose. One, in this plan, increase the earned income tax credit. You can fill out a form on your taxes and get money back if you're eligible for the earned income tax credit. And let's fix it so that any American who works 40 hours a week and has a child in the house is not in poverty. That is a simple, elemental principle that will reduce the incentive of welfare. Second, strengthen the system of child support enforcement. Don't lose $20 billion a year for people who beat their bills and won't support their kids. Let it cross the state line. Third, provide a system of education and training so that people are empowered to do what can be done in this economy. Fourth, deal with the health care issue through the National Health Initiative that I'll say more about in a minute. And then finally, set up a system. It'll take us a while to do it and to work out the financing, but set up a system so that after a certain amount of time, if there is no private sector job, to keep drawing a check, you must make an effort. I think that will be a very good thing. And most people on welfare, once you take care of these other issues, will applaud the American people for changing that system. Nobody likes the system we've got. we've got to have the courage to change it, and I think we will this year. Finally, let me say a word about the last issue, which incorporates so much of the other. If you want to bring the deficit down to zero, which is what our goal ought to be, over a period of years, we must face the biggest exploder of the deficit and perhaps the biggest human dilemma America faces, and that's the health care crisis. We're spending now, this year, we're going to spend 15% of our income on health care. The next nearest country will not spend 10%. Now, we should be spending more than everybody else for a number of reasons. Number one, we do more on medical research than any other country. Number two, we rely more on new technologies, and we enjoy that when we need it, as opposed to somebody else needing it. Number three, we have a more diverse population with more poor people than most other advanced countries, more cases of AIDS than most other advanced countries, and we are a more violent country than any other advanced country, so we pay more money keeping emergency rooms open on the weekend for people who are getting shot and cut up. Now, you can laugh about it. These are true things. I mean, anybody comes and sort of paints some, miracle picture on health care without telling you the truth is not credible. So we cannot we cannot get our costs down to the level of other nations unless we make changes dealing with these big structural things. We could do something about this violence if we wanted to, and I'll have more to say about that as we go through this term. I've already tried to do too much at once, according to the experts. But we could do something about that. But let me tell you, we cannot continue to have health care costs go up at twice the rate of inflation or more. We cannot do that here. This deficit, no matter how much we bring it down in the next 5 years, will start to go right up again because health care costs are going up at a projected 12% a year for the government. 100,000 Americans a month are now losing their health insurance, coming right onto the government rolls. People giving up jobs because they have sick children. People giving up health insurance to keep the small business from going broke. People giving up health insurance because they had to change jobs and they had somebody in their family sick. And there are things that can be done about this. We are spending about 15% of every dollar in health insurance on administrative costs and insurance profit. That is exorbitant. it's about a dime a dollar more than any other country in the world spending. The average doctor in 1980 was taking home 72%, 75% of all the money that came into the clinic that he or she brought in. 75%. You know what it is now? 52%. Lost 23 cents on the dollar. Why? Because of paperwork, the blizzard of insurance requirements, the blizzard of government requirements, and a few other things as well. We can do something about this. Now, the trick is going to be not to spend a lot more money, but to move the money from where it shouldn't be to where it should. And some people will have to pay some more. But we are going to do the very best we can to make sure that the people who are entitled to a reduction in their insurance bills start to get it right away, and that we phase in the burdens of this so that no small business is bankrupt, so that the providers are relieved of a lot of these paperwork burdens, and so that we can actually both lower the cost to the millions and millions of Americans who are entitled to it and stabilize the rate of increase for everybody else. Now, the naysayers can always call any new responsibility that anybody assumes that they are not assuming now a tax. And if I will get you 10, they'll never want to give any credit for all the cost reductions that will go to the tens of millions of Americans who are paying too much now. We have got to do something about this. We're the only advanced country in the world that has no system for covering everybody, maintaining health security for working families, and trying to keep costs somewhere near inflation. We can do that and preserve everything that is best about the American system, keep spending more than everybody else is, but not run this country into a ditch, and we've got to do it. In order to do it, all of us will have to take a view about the national interest that will not enable us to say what's in it for me. We'll have to say what's in it for us. There are a couple of things moving through the Congress that are very hopeful in that regard. One is the Senate passed a bill this week that I strongly support that requires all the lobbyists in Washington to register for a change. You know they didn't have to register before? A whole bunch of them never even registered. And limits very strictly the gifts that any member of Congress can receive without reporting them. They're going to have to report the money that all the lobbyists spend and the lobbyists have to report. And now, we introduced last Friday a new campaign finance reform bill that will limit the cost of congressional campaigns, limit the influence of political action committees, and open the airwaves to challengers and incumbents alike so that the people get a real race every time, and pays for it by repealing the deduction for lobbyist expenses. I hope that those two things can pass. To get economic reform, you're going to have political reform. I'm sure of that. Bring down the deficit. Do it with spending cuts and tax increases. No tax increases without the spending cuts. Invest in education and training, new technologies, incentives to business, changing the welfare system, and have political reform, face health care. That is a big agenda, but that is America's agenda. If we're going to bring this country back, that is what we must do. I hope you and every American, without regard to political party, in good faith, will ask the United States Congress to engage these issues this year so that we can move this country into the future. Thank you very much, and God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Questions?
Among the hallmarks of the City Club of Cleveland is our traditional question and answer period. And in keeping with that tradition, we have selected via lottery members of the audience who will ask questions directly of the President. First question, please.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Sorry.
Mr. President, based on the congressional hearings so far, how do you expect to resolve the issues of gays in the military this July?
I can only tell you what I think should be done and what my guess is will be done. And I'm glad you asked this question. Let me say one thing by way of background. The difference between my position and that of many people in the military, including most folks in the military, is over a very narrow category of people, actually. That is, in the last few months, the armed services have, on their own initiative, after meeting with me, stopped asking people when they join up whether they are homosexual or not. That is not being asked anymore. For many years, that question was not asked. It only started being asked in the relatively recent past. That will solve most of the problems. I do not propose any changes in the Code of Military Conduct. None. Zero. I do not believe that anything should be done in terms of behavior that would undermine unit cohesion or morale. Nothing. Here is what this whole debate is about. It is about whether someone should be able to acknowledge, if asked or otherwise, homosexuality and do nothing else, do nothing to violate the Code of Military Conduct, and not be kicked out of the service. And my position is yes. Others say no. Others say if you let someone acknowledge it, it amounts to legitimizing a lifestyle or putting it on a par with it. I don't see it as that. I just believe that there ought to be a presumption that people ought to be able to serve their country unless they do something wrong. But you need to know that it is not such a big difference. That is what we're arguing about. We're arguing not about any kind of conduct but about whether people can acknowledge that, like that young man who was the 6th Army Soldier of the Year and who's now about to be mustered out because he acknowledged being a homosexual. It is not about asking the American people to approve a lifestyle, to embrace it, to elevate it, to anything else. The question is, if you accept as a fact, as we now know, and as the Pentagon has said, there have been many, many thousands of homosexuals serve our country and serve it well with distinction. Should we stop asking? They say yes, and I say yes. So we solve most of the issues. They say yes, and I say yes. Then, should we change the code of conduct? They say no, and I say no. Not at all. Not on the base. Not any way. No changes in the code of conduct. So the issue is over this: what will happen to this in this narrow category of cases, and that is what is still to be resolved. I hope my position will prevail. Frankly, I think most people believe, as a practical matter, most people who've studied it, that the position I have taken can be worked out and is fairest to the good men and women who served in the service, who've done well. But I think they're frankly worried about having that position look like they're embracing a lifestyle or legitimizing a lifestyle they don't agree with. And I keep saying, that's not what I think we're about. What I think we're about is acknowledging people's right to do right and to be judged by what they do. And that's sort of my position. Yes.
Mr. President, as a resident of Ohio, what action can I take? What can I do to express my outrage at Senator Dole and his cohorts who blocked a legitimate vote on your stimulus package?
Well, what I think we need, let me make a constructive suggestion. I appreciate your sentiments, obviously, but let me make a constructive suggestion. What I think we need to do is to go on now and pass this budget, and then to see where we are. Let me back up and say what I think happened in that deal. I believe that I won the debate with the American people that we needed more investments to create some jobs now because this economy is not producing a lot of new jobs. On the other hand, the Republicans said, well, that's fine, but we ought to pay for it. Well, I had announced this stimulus program as a part of this 5-year deficit reduction program. So it had already been incorporated by the financial markets and everybody else who evaluated this. It was paid for in the sense it was part of the program. But to pass it in time to get the summer jobs and some other things out, we had to, in effect, take it out of sequence, if you see what I mean. To put it up now so we could get the money out to create the jobs in 1993 before Congress could have actually acted on the budget of which it was but a small part. So what I think, to be constructive, what I think you should do is to do whatever you can to encourage the big budget to pass, long-term deficit reduction and investment increases. Then let's watch this unemployment rate. And once we have proved that we have the discipline in Washington to cut spending and reduce the deficit, if we don't generate new jobs, if the economy doesn't pick up in terms of employment, then I think we can come back and look at that. Now that doesn't solve the couple of the severe problems like the summer jobs issues. We're still trying to assess where we are on that. But the larger question of creating jobs is something I think that we need to recognize is primarily going to be dealt with by the big budget, the big issue. But if we need to come back, then I'll need you and all your folks, because we need to get ahead of the curve on this one. Because we were not trying to increase the deficit. This was part of a big 5-year plan, but we had to take it out of sequence because of the summer jobs issues and because we wanted a lot of these jobs created in 1993. Thank you for asking. Yes.
What is your prognosis for the success of your proposed aid for college students who do public services?
Oh, I think it's got very great prospects of success. We've had wonderful bipartisan support for it. Several Republican congressmen in the House of Representatives already asked to be co-sponsors. We have at least 2 supporters, Republican supporters in the Senate. And as far as I know, virtually every Democrat is for it. We've worked very hard to try to work out all the objections, and I think it'll be very, very helpful. And we're going to move as quickly as possible. The national service part, I think, will fly through. The question of cutting down on the cost of the loan program will be more difficult because many of the bankers and others who like the system as it is will oppose it. But it's unconscionable for us to lose $3 billion a year on loan defaults and $1 billion on transaction fees, which could be put into direct loans, which could then be collected. So there'll be a lot of dispute about the loan issue, but I think the national service part of it will go through. It wouldn't hurt for you to express your support, though, to your member of Congress. Thank you.
Mr. President, what legislations do you hope to pass in order to help protect the environment while cutting the national deficit?
Well, I think, there are several things that we want to do. And as you know, the Vice President and I have both worked very hard on this issue since we took office. I want to sign the Biodiversity Treaty, and I expect to do it, committing the United States to help preserve wildlife species. We want to be part of an international effort to preserve wildlife and environmental and plant life in the United States and in the rainforest, especially around the world. We want to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases in this country to 1990 levels over this coming decade, which I think we can do. And we want to invest some of the money that is coming from defense cutbacks into environmental technologies and environmental cleanup here at home, so that those technologies can produce American jobs, many of which can also lead in exporting. The biggest new commercial market in the world in the next 10 years will be the market for various environmental technologies and services. It is a huge gold mine out there waiting to be tapped. When the countries met in Rio last year, regrettably, the Germans and the Japanese were much ahead of the United States in total in environmental technology companies and services. But we have a lot of very successful ones here in the United States, and I hope we can galvanize more of them. Because there really is, if we do this right, cleaning up the environment won't cost us jobs, it'll save us jobs. It'll have a big positive impact.
Mr. President,
He asked a good question. Give him a hand. Isn't he good? Thank you.
Mr. President, perhaps this is a bit premature, but does your health care program incorporate a focus on wellness as well as merely curing illnesses? And what I mean by wellness is universal immunization, health examinations, and so forth. Or perhaps Mrs. Clinton might answer that a little bit better.
Well, let me say that it will, and that if it were just up to the two of us, it would focus on wellness much more. You may know that, for example, there are a lot of countries, in France, for example, where even working class families get a family allowance when a woman is pregnant. You can only draw the family allowance if the mother can prove that she has followed a certain regime of maternal health designed to produce a healthy baby. I saw the other day in the paper that some Republican congressman had suggested that we ought to do the same thing with immunizations for people on public assistance, having to immunize their kids. I thought that was a good idea. I think that we should have a big wellness prevention component of this. That's another point I wish I had made in my remarks, but we are exploring what our options are there. There will be every effort made to have a strong education and prevention and wellness component of this healthcare effort. And I might add that if we can have more clinics in chronically underserved areas and more health educators there, I think we can do that. That's one way you can save a ton of money in the system, and I think you must know that or you would not have asked the question. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, your administration has proposed two new taxes. First, a value-added tax, in which goods would be taxed at each stage of production. Secondly, an energy BTU tax, in which coal, gas, and oil and other forms of energy would be taxed at each stage of use. Are not these taxes inflationary in that they compound at each stage? And secondly, they push up the consumer price index to which wages, prices, and Social Security and other entitlements are indexed to, the consumer price index.
Well, first, let me say, I have proposed a BTU tax, and I'd like to come back to that. I have not proposed a VAT tax. I have not. There's been a lot of rumors about it. You should know, it's interesting that you should know with whom a VAT tax is popular. The Hillary's healthcare group, First Lady's healthcare group, was asked to consider a VAT tax by an unusual coalition of big business and labor interests. Why? Because other countries have a VAT tax. Most other countries have a VAT tax of some kind, and we don't. And a value-added tax is one of the few ways that you can. Somebody who advocated it now wants to get off of it. Anyway, a value-added tax is one of the few ways that you can avoid taxing your own exports and tax someone else's imports. That is, it is placed on things sold in your country. So when our competitors in Europe, for example, have a value-added tax, when they produce things for sale in the United States, it's not subject to the tax. When we sell our stuff over there, it's already carried the full burden of our taxes, and it gets hit with the VAT. So there are a lot of business and labor interests who believe that conceptually, even if we lowered some other tax, we should embrace the VAT tax because it helps us in international trade. I had never thought of it as an answer to the healthcare problem because I thought it would aggravate the maldistribution of paying for the problem. It would allocate the burden of paying for the problem in ways that I didn't think were particularly fair, but that's what it is. Now, on the BTU tax, let me say that America taxes energy less than any other country. There were a lot of suggestions for how we might raise funds to reduce the deficit. The energy tax clearly is the thing which, for all kinds of reasons, had the biggest impact on the financial markets. I was reluctant. There were people who said, well, you ought to have a carbon tax. That's the most polluting. I thought that was unfair to the coal-producing states. Then there were people who said, well, we have real low gas taxes. We do, but states also set gas taxes. We have real low gas taxes. You ought to have a gas tax. I thought that was unfair to the rural areas, particularly west of the Mississippi, where they have much higher per vehicle usage. The reason we decided to go with a BTU tax is that you can put it uniformly on all sources of energy so that it doesn't fall with incredible disproportion on any given sector. Now, the problem is that for the sectors that are especially energy intensive, it hurts them more than a gas tax. And it hurts people who don't pay anything for their energy now. So farmers, for example, that had a fuel tax exemption are dealing with this burden. And you know, we've tried to come to grips with that. I don't think there is a perfect solution, but I like the BTU tax because it promotes energy conservation, it's good for the environment, and it's fairer, I think, to every region than any other energy alternative that we could devise. And then we tried to have, let me follow up on that, we tried to increase the earned income tax credit, that is a proposal, so that for people with earnings of $29,000 a year or less, $30,000 a year less with families, the impact of the BTU tax would be offset by the increase they'd get in the tax cut under the earned income tax credit. Yes.
Over there.
Good afternoon, Mr. President.
Good afternoon.
What I'd like to know is, first of all, your economic plan is twofold. It is to cut spending, and secondly, to encourage more government spending in the private sector. Well, obviously, there's a lot of support for the first part, cutting spending. What I'd like to know is there seems to be a lack of enthusiasm for the second part. One is, how do you plan to get that through? Basically, how do you plan to garner more support for it? And once you get your economic package through, how much input are just ordinary people going to have to this, and when will we feel it at our level?
Well, depending on whether you've borrowed any money since November, you've already felt it. There's no, from the minute the Secretary-designate of the Treasury said after the election, Lloyd Bentsen said we were going to attack the deficit and how we were going to do it and what was going to be in it, we began to have pretty steep drops in interest rates. So if you're paying any kind of interest payments, you've already felt it. The question that, the reason I was for the job stimulus program, to go back, the jobs program that the gentleman asked me in the back, is that I wanted to be able to lower the unemployment rate by another 0.5 percentage point this year through an investment program, because all over the world, I will say again, all over the world, Europe's got a higher unemployment rate than we do. Japan has a much lower unemployment rate than we do because it's got a more closed economy, but they also are not creating jobs, and many of their firms are laying off for the first time in modern history. So I wanted to do that. You will, let me just tick them off. You should be able, if we pass the budget, I think we will secure a healthier financial environment for the next year, and I think that will help everyone. If we can pass health care, I think by next year, people will begin to feel the impact of greater health security. If we can pass it, it's a big job, and it's going to take a lot of work. The student loan program, if it passes, it will affect people immediately. People will be eligible who are now in college for it, as well as those who would wish to go. Same thing with the apprenticeship program. The welfare program, reform program should begin to have effect next year. So those are just some of the things that I think will actually touch people's lives and make a big difference. I think the trick on, to go back to the question the other gentleman asked, to getting people to support the targeted spending for education, training, and technology is to make sure that you lock the spending cuts in first before you do the taxes, and that overall that the spending increases are small compared to the spending cuts, which they are in our plan. So I think that, to me, that's the trick. And that's what I'm trying to achieve, and I hope you'll be with me when we do it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the City Club, we would like to thank President Clinton for addressing us this afternoon.
The answers, but this world to